Turn in your Bible to the book of Genesis chapter 49. We're going to pick up where we left off last time, but before we do, let me remind you of four things. In fact, when you go through chapter 49, you need to always remind yourself of these four things. First of all, Jacob's about to die at this point in the story, so he summoned all of his sons to his deathbed in order to bless them one by one, starting with his oldest son, Reuben. Secondly, the blessings that he bestowed upon his sons were actually prophecies. They were prophecies about what would happen in the future to each of the tribes of Israel. You see, each tribe was named after one of Jacob's sons, and it consisted of that son's descendants. As an example, the tribe of Reuben was named after the son of Jacob's oldest son, Reuben, and it consisted of Reuben's descendants. So the blessing that Jacob gave to Reuben was actually a prophecy about what would happen in the future to the tribe of Reuben. Does everyone understand that? Good. It's not a prophecy about what will happen in the future for Reuben. It is a prophecy about what will happen to the tribe of Reuben. Thirdly, the future and destiny of each tribe was affected by the character and actions of the ancestor they descended from. In other words, Reuben's character and actions affected the future and destiny of the tribe of Reuben. Simeon's cruel actions at Shechem and his lack of character affected the future and the destiny of the tribe of Simeon, and the same holds true for each tribe. And last but not least, the fourth thing, these prophecies are referred to as blessings. But the reason they're referred to as blessings is because of verse number 28. If it wasn't for verse number 28, they would not be referred to as blessings. Look with me, if you would, in verse number 28, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. All these, referring to the 12 sons, are the 12 tribes of Israel. And this is what their father said to them when he blessed them, giving each the blessing appropriate to him. Do you see that? The prophecies given to each one of the 12 sons are referred to as blessings. And that's why chapter 49 is referred to as the blessings of Jacob, even though they're really prophecies. It's because of verse 28. So now that I've reminded you of those four things, let's pick up where we left off last time, which is verse number 13, the prophecy that was given to Zebulun. Or we could say the blessing that was given to Zebulun, but either way it's the same thing. Because the blessing he bestowed upon Zebulun is actually a prophecy about what will happen to the tribe of Zebulun. So whether you call it a blessing or a prophecy doesn't really matter as long as you know what it really is. It's not a blessing to Zebulun. It is a prophecy about what's going to happen in the future to the tribe that he's the eponymous ancestor of. Everyone with me? Here's verse 13. Zebulun shall dwell at the seashore, and he shall be a haven for ships, and his flank shall be towards Sidon. Now, Zebulun was Leah's sixth child, and his name means dwelling. Look back at Genesis chapter 30, verses 19 and 20, and I'm going to show you why Leah named him Zebulun. And Leah conceived again, and bore Jacob the sixth son. And Leah said, God hath endued me with a good dowry. Now will my husband dwell with me, because I have borne him 6 sons. And she called his name Zebulun, because it means dwelling. Now, if you remember, as we were going through the book of Genesis and we got to this part of the story, Jacob spent almost every night in Rachel's tent. In fact, there was a time when Rachel actually manipulated Jacob into cutting Leah off. And we're talking sexually. In other words, she manipulated Jacob into not having sex with Leah. If you don't remember that, go back to Genesis chapter 30 and read verses 14 through 16, and you'll remember that Reuben came in with some mandrakes. And when Rachel saw them, she wanted them, and so Leah actually sold them to her, but what she was asking for, or what the wages were, was she would get to sleep with Jacob. So, when Leah gave birth to Zebulun, her 6th son, she thought that would be an incentive for Jacob to spend more nights with her, because after all, she's producing sons for him and Rachel is not. And that's why she named her 6th son Zebulun, because surely that would make Jacob want to dwell with her or sleep in her tent. Now, let's look at the prophecy that Jacob gave to Zebulun. Look at verse number 13 again. And most of the time I'm not pulling out these word plays, but this is really interesting. Zebulun shall dwell. Wait a minute. Do you see the word play there? Zebulun means dwelling. And it says Zebulun, or dwelling, shall dwell at the seashore. Kind of interesting there. But I'll be honest with you, that's quite frequent in these prophecies. There's always a play on words. We'll get to Gad. In fact, we won't get there tonight. But Gad means troops, and so you'll see the play on words when we get there. But it's really interesting. Dwelling shall dwell at the seashore, and he shall be a haven for ships, and his flank shall be towards Sidon. So the first thing that Jacob said to Zebulun was that his tribe would dwell at the seashore. Now, that clause, at the seashore, can also be translating looking towards the sea, because that preposition, which is usually translated at, can also be translated towards, and the way it is read here, it could be looking towards the sea. So basically it could say, Zebulun shall dwell by the seashore. Well, wait a minute. It could be looking towards. Now, if you look at where the tribe of Zebulun was located, you can see that it was landlocked and not by the sea. Let's take a look at the map. Let me show you what I'm talking about. These are the 12 tribes and the allotment of land that they received. And right there, can you see that, is Zebulun. Now, if you notice, it's not by the seashore. It's not at the seashore. The seashore is here and the seashore is there, but it's not at the seashore. The context tells us that the preposition should have been translated towards the seashore, or in a sense, looking towards the seashore. So here's what's interesting. The tribe of Zebulun was given land that sat between the Mediterranean Sea and the Sea of Galilee. So it didn't matter which way they looked, it was always towards the sea. And when I say that, I'm talking about east and west. If you look towards the sun rising, you would be looking towards the Sea of Galilee. If you look towards where the sun was setting, you would be looking towards the sea or the Mediterranean Sea. So it didn't really matter which way you looked towards the sea when you're talking about east and west. And the Jezreel Valley ran right through the southern part of their tribe. Now, let's look at another map, and I'm going to show you what I'm talking about, and we'll talk a little bit about the Jezreel Valley. Here is Zebulun right here. Here was Asher, it's by or at the seashore. Here's Naphtali, it's at and by the Sea of Galilee seashore. And in between them, landlocked, is Zebulun. But here, starting here at the seashore, coming all the way down, this is the Jezreel Valley. It also comes down into here, but it's all of this flat. If you notice, you can see where the mountains are. See all these mountainous areas? Mountainous areas here, mountainous areas here. Well, here's the valley, the Jordan Valley. So from the Sea of Galilee, you've got the Jordan River that comes all the way down to the Dead Sea. But you can see that it's smooth. That's because it's flat. And then it also is flat right here, comes up, and then all of this is flat, and this is known as the Jezreel Valley. Now, you know it as another name. What name do you know it as? The Valley of Armageddon. Why? Because right down here is Megiddo. See that? And Armageddon is actually two Hebrew words. Harma meaning mountain, and it's the mountain of Megiddo. So that is known as the Valley of Mountain Megiddo or Armageddon. Anyways, but I want you to see where it's located. So, because of their location, they prospered from the Sea of Galilee area, moving their products to the Mediterranean Sea. And they also prospered from the ships in the Mediterranean Sea, moving the products they brought to the Sea of Galilee area. Because you see, on the other side, that's that Transjordan area where the Ammonites were, the Moabites were, all of those people. If they wanted to get anything that was outside of their area, it would come from the sea, the Mediterranean Sea. And you don't want to have to cross over all of these mountains. You want to go on flat land. So the best way to get any of the cargo from the Sea of the Mediterranean Sea to the area of the Sea of Galilee or on further is to go through the Jezreel Valley, the Valley of Armageddon. And if you want anything from the area that's east of that, we're talking about where the Ammonites were, the tribe of Gad, all of those tribes on the other side of the Jordan River, and from the area of the Sea of Galilee. If you want anything from the Hula Valley, the best way to get it to the Mediterranean Sea was to go through the Jezreel Valley. It's flat, it's beautiful, it's easy to travel. So, they prospered from having the cargo from the ships on the Sea of Galilee, the products from those ships being moved to the coast to the Mediterranean Sea, and they prospered from the cargo from the ships from the Mediterranean Sea going east. Now, that's what it means when it says that the tribe of Zebulun shall be a haven for ships. You see, the word haven means a place of refuge or protection. And that's what the tribe of Zebulun provided. It provided safe passage for their cargo from the Sea of Galilee to the Mediterranean Sea and vice versa. In fact, Megiddo coming in, that's at the tip of the tribe of Zebulun. And that's why it always was a very important place, because if you had that town there or that city there, you could protect the whole valley in that area. And they allowed safe haven for the cargoes from the ships to go back and forth. But as a result of that, that tribe prospered immensely. Now, let me ask you a question. Where did Jesus grow up? Not a trick question. Let's forget Bethlehem where he was born. Did he grow up in Bethlehem? No, he was born there. Did he grow up in Egypt? No, he spent probably 2 years in Egypt. But then, when Herod the Great died, he was able to come back. But because of Herod Archelaus, they didn't go back to the land or the tribe of Judah where Joseph and Mary were from. So where did they go? They went to Nazareth. And where was Nazareth located? Does anyone know? Nazareth was located in the land of Zebulun. Let's take another look at the map and let me show you where it was. This is Nazareth. In fact, there's a big old cliff at the edge of that because the city actually grows down into this. But what's interesting is Zebulun actually comes right through here and takes a big chunk out of this Jezreel Valley, but then it comes right up here, goes right next to the mountaintops, and then comes on up into this area. But where their prosperity came from was these two valleys. But Nazareth was right there. Now, why would I want you to know that? Well, we're not going to talk about it tonight because we're not going to be able to get to the tribe of Naphtali. But I do want you to remember that Nazareth was located in the tribe of Zebulun, and it's very important because when we get to the tribe of Naphtali, we're going to see a prophecy in the Old Testament that foretells what Jesus will do in the land of Zebulun and Naphtali. But anyways, I don't want to get ahead of myself, so we're not going to go there tonight. You're going to have to wait on that. So let's look at the blessing that Jacob gave to Issachar in verses 14 and 15. Notice what it says. Issachar is a strong ass, a donkey in other words, couching down between two burdens. And he saw that rest was good in the land, that it was pleasant. And he bowed his shoulders to bear and became a servant unto tribute. Now, I want you to notice that the tribe of Issachar is being compared to an ass or a donkey. Now, today, if you compared someone to an ass or a donkey, they wouldn't take it as a compliment, would they? No, they'd probably get offended unless they're a Democrat. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean you could take it that way. But anyways, they would probably get offended because in ancient times, it was a good thing, but today it's a bad thing. Now, why was it a good thing back in ancient times? Well, in ancient times, donkeys were very valuable animals. And the reason they were valuable was because they could carry very heavy loads and they were very sure-footed. And if you looked at the map, as we were showing you spots on it, you could see that the majority of Israel is very mountainous. So you were able to use donkeys as pack animals, and they could go up and down mountains on very narrow trails. So you could take your cargo to places that you couldn't otherwise take it if you didn't have a donkey. So Jacob likened Issachar to a donkey couching down between two burdens, which was a compliment because it meant that the tribe of Issachar was big and strong. And it was. In fact, it was the third largest tribe according to the census that was taken in the book of Numbers, chapter 26. Now, the land that was assigned to them was lush and fertile because they inherited the eastern end of the Jezreel Valley. And what valley is that again? The Valley of Armageddon. But we won't refer to it as that because all through the Bible, it is not referred to as the Valley of Armageddon until you get to Revelation. But I want you to think about, or I want you to think of this valley in the terms of how the Bible describes it. So it's not the Valley of Armageddon. It's the Jezreel Valley. Now let's look at that map again. Let me show you where Issachar was. Issachar started up here. Mount Tabor is kind of the northern border of it. It includes Mount Tabor. Comes right down here and right next to Nazareth. Nazareth is in the land of Zebulun, but it's just very close. And it comes right down to this lake, and it cuts off the tail of the lake. Comes all the way down to the foothills here, but it incorporates all of this eastern part of the Jezreel Valley, and then it comes up a little bit, comes over all the way to the Jordan River, and then back over to the Mount Tabor. So it's all this area right in here, but not Scythopolis. Scythopolis is a very interesting site. It was part of the Decapolis, and if you remember, the Gentiles lived in this area at the time of Jesus. So when we go there and you see the ruins, you're going to see how the Gentiles lived among the Jews. But anyways, the land that was assigned to them was very, very fertile, and it was very lush. And because they inherited this eastern part of it, it was like they were given almost the best portion of land. So they couldn't complain because it was wonderful. And they were very hard workers, so they could turn it into really an oasis, even though it was already an oasis. It could produce, it was just a wonderful place to produce all types of grains. But even though they were hard workers, the tribe of Issachar had one fault. And that one fault was this: they had a very passive, docile temperament. In other words, the tribe of Issachar were lovers and not fighters. Ever heard that? Well, I'm a lover and not a fighter. Well, that was the tribe of Issachar. They were lovers and not fighters. So even though they had a very large tribe and they were a strong tribe, they didn't like to fight. And if you study the history of their tribe, you'll find that they never expelled ever the Canaanites from their land. In fact, they actually paid tribute to the Canaanites so that they could live in peace. They would rather negotiate with them and pay them off, in a sense, protection money, tribute to them so they could live in peace. And yet, they could have conquered them quite easily, but they preferred to pay tribute to them rather than fight. Now, look back at verse number 15, and specifically the last part of verse 15, and tell me if Jacob didn't nail this prophecy. It says, Issachar saw that rest was good and the land that it was pleasant, and he bowed his shoulder to bear and became a servant unto tribute. Now I'm telling you, when you study the history of the 12 tribes of Israel, you'll realize that Jacob's prophecies were spot on. They were as accurate as you could get. In fact, I'll be honest with you, when you go to seminary, you go to a Bible college and you're taking Old Testament introduction, you always have to have what's called higher criticism. And they start discussing who really wrote these books. And one of the reasons they look at this and they say, well, it couldn't have been Moses that wrote the first 5 books. And the reason why is because when you look at the prophecies that Jacob gave and then you study the history of Israel, there is no way he could have predicted that. See, they don't believe in the supernatural. But it is amazing to me that as you study the history of these 12 tribes, and then you go back to Genesis chapter 49, the blessings, the prophecies that he gave to each one of his sons, telling them the future of their descendants, of the tribes that will represent them, it is amazing how spot on Jacob was. In fact, the next one is going to blow you away. This is actually my favorite prophecy, believe it or not, in all of them, with the exception of Judah. Judah and Dan are just unbelievable. So let's look at the blessing that Jacob gave to Dan. Look at verses 16 through 18. Dan will govern his people like any other tribe in Israel. Dan will be a snake beside the road, a poisonous viper along the path that bites the horse's hooves so its rider is thrown off. I trust in you for salvation, O Lord. Now, to understand this prophecy, you have to understand why Dan was compared to a serpent or to a snake. You see, throughout the scriptures, the snake is always a symbol of Satan. Let me say that again. Throughout the scriptures, the snake is always a symbol of Satan. Always. So by comparing Dan to a snake, Jacob was prophesying that the tribe of Dan would have a satanic influence on the other tribes, and they did. In fact, almost immediately after they were allotted their land, they left their land and they migrated north. And the reason they migrated north is because the Philistines lived in that area that they were allotted, and they didn't want to have to fight with them. And so what they decided to do was just to migrate somewhere where it would be very easy to conquer. So they migrated north, and they found this sleepy little town called Laish near the foot of Mount Hermon. And there they massacred all of the citizens, and they renamed the city Dan. And then they set up a graven image, an idol, along with their own priests to worship that idol. And we're talking about almost immediately after they're allotted this land. So almost from the very beginning, Dan became a cult center for idolatrous worship. And if you want to read the story, just go to Judges chapter 18, but I'm just going to read one verse. This is Judges 18:30. Notice what it says. Now here, they just got through coming out of Egypt, 40 years in the wilderness. They're allotted their land, and immediately they decide they don't want their land, so they go up north. This is when this happened. And the children of Dan set up the graven image, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, he and his sons were priests to the tribe of Dan until the day of the captivity of the land. Now, their idolatry didn't stop here. If you remember when Israel was split into two kingdoms, Rehoboam, who was the son of Solomon, he was supposed to inherit the kingdom, but Solomon had pushed the people so much that the people said, hey, you need to back off a little, and Jeroboam was their spokesman, and Rehoboam says, well, give me a day to think about it, and then he asked his counselors. The older men said, yes, you need to do that. If you'll do that, they will love you forever. They'll support you and do whatever you want. The younger people said, don't do it. We want to live high on the hog. So what he told them is, you just tell them you're going to be even harsher than your father. And of course, the 10 northern tribes, they split. Well, the king of the 10 northern tribes, also known as Israel from that point on, the 2 southern tribes are known as what? Judah. But the 10 northern tribes are also sometimes referred to as Ephraim. You need to know that. Israel and Ephraim refer to the 10 northern tribes from this point on. And Jeroboam is their king. So he became the king of the 10 northern tribes, and he promoted idolatry as a means of preventing his people from traveling to worship or traveling to Jerusalem to worship. So he made 2 golden calves. He placed one of those golden calves in Bethel, and the other was placed in Dan. Look at 1 Kings chapter 12. I'm going to read verses 26 through 30. This is after the kingdom split. Jeroboam thought to himself, unless I am careful, the kingdom will return to the dynasty of David. When these people go to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord, they will again give their allegiance to King Rehoboam of Judah. They will kill me and make him their king instead. So on the advice of his counselors, the king made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, it is too much trouble for you to worship in Jerusalem, even though the Mosaic law said that all males were required 3 times a year to go to Jerusalem. Here it is. That is too hard for you to do that. Look, Israel, these are the gods who brought you out of Egypt. He placed these calf idols in Bethel and in Dan, at either end of his kingdom. But this became a great sin for the people who worshiped the idols, traveling as far north as Dan to worship the one there. Now, here's what's kind of interesting. The people really liked the traditional pilgrimage to Jerusalem because it was a wonderful time to really get to know your friends and your family, and it was kind of like a vacation. 3 times a year, Feast of Passover, Feast of Pentecost, the Feast of Trumpets, you had to travel to Jerusalem. And all of your neighbors are Jews, and they're going to travel too. That's why if you remember when Jesus was at the Feast of Passover in Jerusalem and his parents were going home, they thought Jesus was with the other kids until that night. Why did they think that? Because they would travel in these big groups as they made the pilgrimage. Well, the people really enjoyed the pilgrimage. It was a wonderful time. And so they were used to having to do that to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year. So instead of just going to the nearest place, which was Bethel, the majority of the people would travel to Dan instead of Bethel. And that's why Dan became the cult center of the northern kingdom. Now, because of their history with idolatry and the satanic influence that they tried to exert over the other tribes, God omitted them from the tribes of Israel. Cut them off. Remove them. Why? Because Dan is a snake. Dan is a satanic influence over the other tribes. In fact, here's what's interesting. Dan is listed as one of the 12 tribes of Israel in 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, when it lists all of the tribes. But when the genealogies of each tribe is given in chapters 2 through 10, Dan's genealogy is the only one that's not given. Nothing is given about their tribe. Why? Because Dan is a snake. And it struck at the hooves of the horse and threw its rider off. It caused many to come into idolatry. Not only that, but the 144,000 Jews that are going to be sealed during the time of the tribulation in the book of Revelation. You remember the 144,000 that are going to be sealed? These are Jews. 12,000 from every tribe. Nope, not every tribe. Because not one of the 144,000 Jews that are going to be sealed comes from the tribe of Dan. In fact, the tribe of Dan is the only tribe that is left out when it comes to counting the 144,000 Jews. Look at Revelation chapter 7. Let's read verses 4 through 8. And I heard how many were marked with the seal of God. 144,000 were sealed from all the tribes of Israel. From Judah, 12,000 from Reuben, 12,000 from Gad, 12,000 from Asher, 12,000 from Naphtali, 12,000 from Manasseh, 12,000 from Simeon, 12,000 from Levi. Underline that. 12,000 from Issachar, 12,000 from Zebulun, 12,000 from Joseph, 12,000 from Benjamin, 12,000. Wow. Now here's what's interesting. Dan's not in there. They put Levi in there. And if you noticed, Ephraim, of course, Joseph takes Ephraim and says, you've got Manasseh and Ephraim, double portion. But Dan's not mentioned. They are omitted. Why? Because Dan was a snake. It practiced idolatry, and it tried to influence the other tribes to do the same. And because of that, the tribe of Dan has been removed, has been omitted from the tribes of God, or the tribes of Israel. Now, here's what's interesting. When the millennium comes, when Jesus Christ returns and he sets up his kingdom here on the earth and he reigns for 1,000 years on this earth, Dan will once again be listed as one of the tribes, and they will receive the inheritance of land just like the other tribes. Turn with me, if you would, to the book of Ezekiel chapter 48. I'm going to read verses 1 and 2, and I want you to understand that Ezekiel chapter 48 is about the millennium. Notice what it says. Here is the list of the tribes of Israel and the territory each is to receive. The territory of Dan is in the extreme north. They migrated north and they were in the extreme north. Now they're going to be added back in, no longer omitted. Its boundary line follows the Hethlon road to Lebahomath and then runs on to Hazar Enan on the border of Damascus with Hamath to the north. Dan's territory extends all the way across the land of Israel from east to west. Asher's territory lies south of Dan's and also extends from east to west. And the rest of chapter 48, it's telling you exactly where it is. But let me show you a map of the land that each tribe is going to receive during the millennium. Now remember when I showed you the first map where they were? Boy, it's just all over the place. But during the millennium, this is how the land will be allotted. Straight across Dan. Underneath it, Asher. Underneath it, Naphtali. Underneath it, Manasseh, Ephraim, Reuben, Judah. And then this is huge. Who is the prince? The prince's portion. Jesus. And all of this, where Jerusalem is just this little place right now, all of this is going to be Jerusalem. And the temple's going to be huge during the time of the millennium. Benjamin, Simeon, Issachar, Zebulun, Gad, and we get all the way down into the Negev. But anyways, what I want you to see is according to Ezekiel, their omission from the 12 tribes of Israel is only temporary. Because during the millennium, the tribe of Dan is included once more as one of the tribes. Now, why would I spend all this time on this? Well, here's why. Now that we know the history of the tribe of Dan, we can now look back at the prophecy that Jacob gave to Dan, and it makes a little more sense. Let me see if I can give you an example of this. How many of you have ever received a prophecy from someone? How many of you grew up in a mainline denomination that didn't believe in the spiritual gifts? They told you they ceased at the end of the apostolic age. Anyone? I grew up in a church that taught that the spiritual gifts ceased at the end of the apostolic age, and then I kind of got out of my sheltered environment, and I found out that the spiritual gifts are still in operation today. I operate in the spiritual gifts, but we are a seeker-sensitive church, which means that we exercise the gifts usually one-on-one. And as a result of that, you don't see it corporately here because many times you have people experimenting or it's really not the spiritual gift. You're like, well, I won't go into that. But anyways, how many of you ever received a prophecy? And when you receive that prophecy, it's like, man, that doesn't make sense at all. That's the weirdest thing I've ever heard. Boy, they missed it. That's not of God. And then 2 or 3 years later, something happens, and the Holy Spirit quickens your mind and says, you remember that prophecy? And you go, oh my gosh, that's exactly what was prophesied to me. And it blows your mind. That's happened to me before. I had people write a prophecy to me, and it's like, oh my gosh, that's just as stupid can be. There's no way. Now, having the poker face that I have, they didn't know that. But 2 or 3 years later, it's like, wow. Well, here's what's interesting. When you read the prophecy that was given to the tribe of Dan, it's like, man, that's weird. That doesn't even make sense. Until the events happen during the history of the tribe of Dan. And then after these events occur, you look back to the prophecy and you go, oh my gosh, I can't believe that. So let's look at the prophecy now that we know the history of the tribe of Dan, verse by verse, beginning in verse 16. Dan will govern his people like any other tribe in Israel. Well, that's strange. Why wouldn't they govern their people like every other tribe? And it does beg that question. Why wouldn't the tribe of Dan govern their people like all the other tribes? And the answer is because they're going to be omitted, removed from the tribes of Israel. They will no longer be a tribe that governs its own people. Remember, as we were going through this, we told you that Israel is a nation of many nations. And I don't mean many, M-A-N-Y, I mean many. Kind of like the United States of America. The United States is made up of different states, all underneath one government, and that's the way the tribe of Israel was. You had a king, but before the king, you had all of these different tribes, and they governed their own people. And even when the king came, these tribes still remained separate, and they had what would be the equivalent of our governor. And they governed their own people, but they were united with the other tribes to form Israel. So when you read verse number 16 and it says, well, the tribe of Dan will govern their own people like any of the other tribes, you go, well, that doesn't even make sense. That's what tribes do. And then it's like, well, wait a minute. The implication is they're no longer going to be a tribe. Why? Verse 17. Then we go to verse number 17. Dan will be a snake beside the road, a poisonous viper along the path that bites the horse's hoof so its rider is thrown off. And the implication is either killed or hurt extremely bad. So what this is saying is the reason they're going to be omitted is because they're a snake and a satanic influence on the other tribes. But the good news is they won't be omitted permanently, only temporarily. In fact, one day they're going to be restored as one of the tribes of Israel, and they will once again govern their own people like all of the other tribes. That's what verse 16 is saying. But when will that happen? Verse 18. Look at verse 18. I trust in you for salvation, O Lord. You know, salvation, we think about what salvation means. In Greek, it's sozo. If it's a noun, it's soterion. But anyways, it means complete restoration. It means that we're restored physically, spiritually, mentally, emotionally. It means that once we were dead, but now we're made alive. So even if this physical body dies, my spirit still lives, and one day my body will be resurrected. We are saved. So here it comes in and says, I trust in you for salvation, O Lord. Why? Because this tribe is going to be omitted. It's going to be removed. It's going to be gone. But when salvation comes, we are going to go back to verse number 16. We're going to be restored again. And Dan once more will govern its own people like all the other tribes, implying that it will be restored again. And when will this take place? When salvation finally comes to the Jews, generally speaking, the tribe of Dan is going to be restored and included as one of the tribes. Now, when will the day of salvation come? When will that be? We'll look at Zechariah chapter 12, verse 8, and then we're going to go to chapter 13, verse number 2. Notice what it says. On that day, the Lord will defend the people of Jerusalem. The weakest among them will be as mighty as King David, and the royal descendants will be like God. Wow. Go a little bit further. For on that day I will begin to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. When's that going to take place? When are the nations going to come against Jerusalem? Battle of Armageddon. Then I will pour out a spirit of grace and prayer on the family of David and all the people of Jerusalem. They will look on me whom they have pierced and mourn for him as for an only son. Who is this? Who is the person they've pierced? Jesus. They will grieve bitterly for him as for a firstborn son who has died. The sorrow and mourning in Jerusalem on that day will be like the great mourning for Hadad Rimmon in the Valley of Megiddo. All Israel will mourn, each clan by itself, and with the husbands separate from their wives. The clan of David will mourn alone, as will the clan of Nathan, the clan of Levi, and the clan of Shammai. Each of the surviving clans from Judah will mourn separately, and with the husbands separate from their wives. On that day, a fountain will be opened for the dynasty of David. Remember, we talked about the dynasty of David last Sunday. What's the dynasty of David? We're going to have the Messiah sitting on the throne forever. And for the people of Jerusalem, a fountain to cleanse them from all their sins and impurity. And on that day, says the Lord of heaven's armies, I will erase idol worship throughout the land so that even the names of the idols will be forgotten. I will remove from the land both the false prophets and the spirit of impurity that came with them. In other words, on the day of salvation, when the Lord returns, on the great day of atonement, the Jews will look upon Jesus whom they have pierced, and they're going to repent, and they're going to be saved. On that day, Jesus will take the throne, and he'll reign for 1,000 years. People, that's the millennium. On that day, all idol worship will be removed because salvation has come. And on that day, the tribe of Dan will be restored and included as one of the tribes of Israel. Now, who could have predicted this? That's why liberal scholars say Moses couldn't have written that. This had to have been rewritten after the history of Israel. Because who could have known that the tribe of Dan would have been omitted? Who could have known all of these things? But I'm here to tell you that's the God we serve. This is the God who knows the future. He knows everything that's going to happen. So when we look at this prophecy, verse number 16, it starts off with, Dan will govern its own people like all the other tribes. You go, what? And then it's like, wait a minute. It's acting as if the tribe of Dan is going to be taken away and restored. Well, why would it be taken away? Verse 17, Dan is a snake. It lies and it bites the hooves of the horse and throws its rider, damaging the other tribes. It has a satanic influence. But on the day of salvation, verse 18, I pray for that because that's when it's going to be restored again. Wonderful prophecy.